المرسلين وصلى وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الملأ الأعلى إلى النبي وصلى وسلم على سيدنا محمد حتى ترث الأرض ومن عليها وأنت خير الوارثين وصلى وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Continuing with the book Wasa'il Wusul ila Shama'il Wusul, the means of approach to understanding the inner and outer beauty and character of the Prophet ﷺ. And the author has reached the point in which he would describe the greeting of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ is encouraging people or encouraging the Sahaba to greet each other with the words of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And he would even explain that if a person says Assalamu alaikum, then there is a certain reward. If they say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, there is a greater reward. If they say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, then the reward is yet even greater. And the Quran itself teaches us وَإِذَا حُيِّيتُم بِتَحِيَّةٍ فَحَيُّوا بِأَحْسَنَ مِنْهَا أَوْ رُدُّوهَا. When you are greeted with a greeting, then reply to it with something that is better than it, or return the like of it. So if someone says Assalamu alaikum, you can reply with Wa alaikum, Wa alaikum salam. But it would then be better to say Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. If someone says Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, then you can reply with Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And if someone says Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, then one replies by saying Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and then one can make a dua for the person if one wants to follow the instructions of the Quran by returning that with which is. And so the author goes on to say that none of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ called him or invited him except that he would reply and say labbaik. The Prophet ﷺ would pass by young children, he would greet them and pet their heads. وَكَانَ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم إِذَا مَرَّ عَلَى الصِّبْيَانِ سَلَّمَ عَلَيْهِمْ ثُمَّ بَاسَطَهُمْ. Whenever the Prophet ﷺ used to pass by children and young ones, he would greet them. Even though they were playing or they were in a group, he would greet them and then he would pet them on the heads. And again, this is that compassion that the Prophet ﷺ has as being almost like a father for each and every single one of the creation. And the Prophet ﷺ did not just look at people or look at children as children. He looked at them as being his own children, and he treated everyone as though they were his own children. And this is, we know, that spiritual nature. The Prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran has described the wives of the Prophet ﷺ as being the mothers of the believers. And so by analogy, it can be understood that the Prophet ﷺ is the father of the believers, the spiritual father of the believers. وكان صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا قدم من سفر تلقي بصبيان أهل بيته. When the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم would return from a journey, he would be received and welcomed by the young children of his family. Meaning it was the young children of the family that would go out to first greet him and first receive him. And we would find even this is the practice of some of the pious. When they return from travels, the families would come in and they would bring the young children to the airport to receive them. Or whenever the first people they greet them when they enter the house would be the young children. And this was the practice of those around the Prophet ﷺ when he returned from a travel. وكان صلى الله عليه وسلم يؤتى بالصبيان فيبرك عليهم ويحنكهم ويدعو لهم. And the Prophet ﷺ would would be brought with, or children would be brought into his company, and then he would make dua for them, he would bless them, he would do tahniq. And tahniq is the practice when a newborn is brought to the Prophet ﷺ, then he would chew on a date, right, make it malleable, or make it soft, chew on the date, and then he would rub the insides of the gums and the teeth of the child with this. Over and above this being a sunnah and a practice which done by the Prophet ﷺ has immense benefits spiritually, but also there is great health benefits. Scientifically also, they have discovered that the sugar content and especially dates, the nourishment that the dates provide for an infant is imperative for brain development in children that particular age. And children that particular age, they know how to suck. So if the date is made mushy and put and rubbed onto their gums, rubbed onto their palates, and even onto their teeth, then, or the gums, they don't have teeth, but where the teeth would be, they would then continue to suck on that. And there are also certain Sahaba that when their children were brought, the Prophet ﷺ found that the children actually loved these dates. They would suck it in a very uh, passionate way. And the Prophet ﷺ then even perhaps he made a mention that these are the children of the Ansar, and the Ansar love dates. And dates has immense nutrition for the body. And so this is called tahniq. And this practice has continued where people would till today take their newborn children. Sometimes some would try at the very first instant when the child is born, before anything goes into the child's stomach, before even the mother's milk goes into the child's stomach, they would try and take the child for tahniq to one of the pious people of the community to try and get their barakah to be the first thing. And this was also the practice of the Sahaba. When their children were born, sometimes they would not allow the mother to feed the child until they had taken it to the Prophet ﷺ to be fed this date, this form of tahniq, so that the first thing that entered the stomach of the child was the saliva of the Prophet ﷺ. And this practice we will find parents naturally have this compassion for children. When a child is growing up, a mother sometimes when a mother is also feeding a child that is now coming off milk and starts to eat solids, we will find that the mother would even soften the food with her own mouth, with her own saliva, and then give to the child, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. وَكَانَ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ أَرْحَمَ النَّاسِ بِالصِّبْيَانِ وَالْعِيَالِ. The Prophet ﷺ was the most merciful of people towards young children and to his family. Right? He was the most merciful. If mercy was his nature, then towards his family and those young ones in the families around him, he was even more merciful to them. وكان صلى الله عليه وسلم يزور الأنصار ويسلم على صبيانهم ويمسح رؤوسهم. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم would visit the Ansar, the helpers, greet their young children and rub their heads. Whenever he would see children, he would pay attention to their children. And this is also a practice and a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And we should also try and implement this. Sometimes when we meet people at the masjid or wherever we are and they might have young children with them, sometimes it's the practice of certain people, they would just greet each other, but they don't pay attention to the young ones. Whereas the Prophet ﷺ was acutely aware of everyone that was around him and in the room, and he would give each one their attention. So even there was one particular Sahabi, he was very, very young, and his name was Umair. And he had a bird which had passed away, a bird he played with, and this bird to some extent passed away, whatever happened to the bird. And when the Prophet ﷺ then met the Sahaba, his child was with him, the Prophet ﷺ even asked him and he said, Ya Aba Umair, ma fa'ala al-Nughayr. The Prophet ﷺ then used this term of endearment, saying, Oh Abu Umair, what did Nughayr used to do? Right? Reminding that young boy about the child, but acknowledging also his hurt and his pain of this bird that has passed away. And it is said that that young Sahabi's name was Amr. And Umair is a diminutive form of the word Amr. It can be used as a term of endearment or to make something smaller. And the scholars say that there was also an indication that this young Sahabi wouldn't live very long. And it was not long after that he passed away at a young age. And so the Prophet ﷺ would even acknowledge children. For example, if a child's toy breaks, right, or you happen to see a child with a certain toy all the time, and a certain day you don't see him with a toy, you have to ask him about it. It would be a sunnah to ask about it, make them feel special, and pay attention to them. And it was the practice also of the pious to always carry some sort of sweets or snacks which they would then give to children who they meet, whether they know those children or they don't know those children. وعن يوسف بن عبد الله بن سلام رضي الله تعالى عنهما قال سماني رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يوسف وأقعدني في حجره ومسح على رأسه. Right? Yusuf bin Abdullah bin Salam said the Prophet ﷺ named me Yusuf, seated me in his lap and rubbed my head. Meaning he recalls this was a very young Sahabi, the son of one of the Sahaba, who himself is a Sahabi. And he recalls how when his father brought him to the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ placed him on his lap, named him, and even rubbed on his head. And sometimes with newborns as well, they would read Ayatul Kursi, they would read Surah Alam Nashrah, Surah Fatiha by placing the hand on the chest of the child. They would read even Surah Al-Qadr by placing the hand on the head of the child, and there are spiritual benefits in allowing the child to listen to Quran or have Quran recited around, and dhikr and different forms of salawat and durud recited around a newborn infant, and also while this infant is still a fetus in the womb of its mother. The positive effects of dhikr, of salawat, of Quran, and also of amicable character affect the child. And if a parent, one or two parents, from when the child is in the womb of the mother, they have bad character, the child receives a portion of that bad character. And if they are amicable in their characters, the child receives a portion of that as well. وكان صلى الله عليه وسلم يلاعب زينب بنت أم سلمة ويقول يا زوينب يا زوينب مرارا. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم would play with Zainab, the daughter of Salama, repeatedly and say, little Zainab, little Zainab. Zainab is the name of this girl, and Zuwainab is this diminutive form, just as Umair is the diminutive of Amr. In Arabic has this, where you put something on the scale of fu'ailun, and it gives it a sense of a meaning of endearment, or to show that something is little bit. So when students would write letters to their teachers, they wouldn't sign off their letters saying talibukum, meaning your student. They would say tuwaylibukum or tulaymidikum, right? Your little or your humble student. Now, وكان صلى الله عليه وسلم يركب الحسن والحسين على ظهره ويمشي على يديه ورجليه ويقول نعم الجمل جملكما ونعم العدلان أنتما وربما فعل ذلك بينهما وهما على الأرض. نعم, the Prophet ﷺ would carry Sayyidina Hassan and Sayyidina Hussein on his back while crawling around on his hands and feet. And we see how the Prophet ﷺ, notwithstanding the great stature, right, and awe of his personality and who he was, the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but when he would play with his grandchildren, he would crawl on all fours, right, and he would put Sayyidina Hassan and Hussein on his back, just as the one would play with children to make as though they are riding a horse, right, and he would play with them in this particular way. He would carry Hassan and Hussein sallallahu alaihi wasallam on his back while crawling around on his hands and feet, and he would say, what an excellent camel you have, right? So he would refer to himself as being their camel and say, what an excellent camel, or what a nice camel that you have. And then he would also tell them what excellent riders you are. And there's different narrations of this. Once one of the Sahaba, I think it was Sayyidina Abu Bakr, one of the Sahaba come into the presence of the Prophet while he's playing with Sayyidina Hassan and Hussein. And he's on all fours, and Sayyidina Hassan and Hussein is on his back. So the Sahaba makes the comment that, Ya Rasulullah, what an excellent mount don't they have? Meaning they are riding on your back. And then the Prophet replied and saying, what excellent riders are they not? Meaning the virtue of who they are, that they themselves are people of virtue, what excellent riders they are. And he would perhaps sometimes and sometimes he would let them take turns. So sometimes he would put Sayyidina Hassan on his back and walk with him on all fours, and then sometimes put Sayyidina Hussein individually on his back. ودخل الحسن وهو صلى الله عليه وسلم قد سجد فركب على ظهره فأبطأ في سجوده حتى نزل الحسن فلما فرغ قال له بعض أصحابه يا رسول الله قد أطلت سجودك قال إن ابني ارتحلني فكرهت أن أعجله أي جعلني كالراحلة فركب على ظهري. Right? Once the Prophet ﷺ, on one occasion, he was in prayer, he was prostrating, and this was the fard prayer. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ, we can see his mercy with children, even though he was in the fard prayer, he was not distracted by Sayyidina Hassan and Hussein being around him and also playing on his back while he was in sujood. So while he was in sajda, Sayyidina Hassan entered into the masjid and climbed onto his back. And obviously we know the Prophet ﷺ would play with the Sahaba in their home. Would play with Sayyidina Hassan and Hussein in his home, and he would make them jump onto his back. So one day in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ was right next to his home. It was a few steps. As he walks out of his home, already he's into the masjid. And so Sayyidina Hassan and Hussein, and we know how babies and children are, they do not know and realize, infants do not realize public and private space. So they see the Prophet ﷺ in sajda, they come into the masjid, so naturally what are they going to do? He jumps onto the back of Sayyidina Hassan jumps onto the back of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? Sayyidina Hassan entered and climbed onto his back. The Prophet ﷺ lengthened his prostration until Sayyidina Hassan radiallahu ta'ala anhu climbed down. And so the Prophet ﷺ remained in sajda until Sayyidina Hassan finished playing on his back. When he finished, some of the companions said, Ya Rasulullah, you have prolonged your prostration. I mean, it was a very long time that you remained in sajda. And he said, my son climbed up onto my back, meaning he made me like his mount, right? Obviously referring to the way he plays with them sometimes. And I disliked to rush him, meaning I didn't want to get up. And there would have been nothing wrong with the Prophet even got up and put him on the side or got up in him gently, but the Prophet allowed him to completely take his share of his entertainment, and the Prophet did not even want to rush him in that. That is, he mounted the Prophet's back as if he was a mount, meaning this is what the Prophet told the Sahaba, he climbed on my back. Now, وعن ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يصلي والحسن والحسين يلعبان ويقعدان على ظهره. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to, as narrated by Ibn Mas'ud, he was once praying while Sayyidina Hassan and Hussein were playing and sitting on his back. And we can see that children do not climb onto the back of someone, especially if they are in salah, except if they feel this extreme sense of safety and amicability, right? And it gives an inkling into how the Prophet would then play with them in the private moments, right? And one has to be merciful towards children. One cannot be upright, one cannot be stern with young children. Once a Bedouin came into the presence of the Prophet ﷺ and he saw the Prophet ﷺ kissing Sayyidina Hassan and Hussein, and he told the Prophet ﷺ, I have 10 children and I do not, and I've never kissed any one of them. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ then mentioned to him, there's two narrations. One verse is that, Man la yarham la yurham, the one who does not show mercy will not be shown mercy. And in another narration, that what is it that I can do if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has removed mercy from your heart? Right? And so it's a part of mercy that a person is gentle and caring with children. وعن ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يصلي والحسن والحسين يلعبان ويقعدان على ظهره. وكان أبو هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه يقول رأيت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وقد أخذ بيد الحسن بن علي ووضع رجليه على ركبتيه وهو يقول ترقى ترقى عين بقى حزقة حزقة. نعم. Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala anhu narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, I saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam take Sayyidina Hassan bin Ali and place his legs on his knees. So he takes Sayyidina Hassan, he lifts him up and puts his knees, the knees of Sayyidina Hassan while he's still this infant child, this young child, and puts him onto the knees of the Prophet ﷺ. And generally people play these games with children, right? That you hold the child's hands and you allow the child to then climb up onto your knees and then climb up onto your thighs, and right, sometimes even they would want to somersault over, and we see this is how the Prophet ﷺ even played with Sayyidina Hassan. So he would place him on his knees and say, climb up, O little-eyed one, O Huzaqqa. And there is these words the Prophet ﷺ used to describe him. Little-eyed one is, he had the eyes of a certain type of bird, meaning in terms of endearment, meaning sometimes when people play with children, they even make up words which perhaps might not even have any meanings. It might even be a silly word, but this can also be regarded as the sunnah. This is how the Prophet ﷺ played with Sayyidina Hassan and Hussein. And it is natural that when a person plays with children, they would murmur certain things and make up certain words, right, out of a form of endearment to children. And this is something which is praiseworthy. And in explaining, the scholars, when they explain about these words the Prophet ﷺ used, Ain Baqqa, Huzaqqa, Huzaqqa, the scholars say that the Prophet ﷺ would swing Hassan around and say, Huzaqqa, climb up, O little-eyed one. And Huzaqqa means a weak person whose footsteps are close together. And Hassan would climb up till his feet reached the Prophet ﷺ's chest. Ibn al-Athir said the Prophet ﷺ mentions this out of playfulness and tenderness towards him. So the Prophet ﷺ likened him to a type of bird that had a particular type of walk. And we know children, when they are young and they're still learning to walk, how they walk, right? Unsettling, and they're almost tripping over their feet. And the Prophet ﷺ likened this to maybe perhaps a certain bird who had a similar walk. And so the Prophet ﷺ would dearly call Sayyidina Hassan by this particular name. قال في لسان العرب وفي الحديث أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يرقص الحسن والحسين ويقول حزقة حزقة ترقى عين بقى. This is an interesting narration where we say the Prophet ﷺ would, the word here in Arabic means yuraqqisu, means raqs in Arabic means to dance, right? And so technically he would almost be playing with them in the form of allowing them to dance, right? And when it was children, obviously, and you're trying to make them walk up, not when, unfortunately in English, when you use the term dance, it has different connotations. But in Islam and in the Sharia, we have also with children would have certain types of movements, which in Arabic is referred to as dancing, and there's nothing wrong. The military as well, what we call certain types of marching, right? We call it marching in English. There are certain types of marching and also military movements of the way they would even dance with swords, right? And put on a sort of display. It's a type of dance in the Sharia that is permissible as well. Also, the Arabs would have in their tribal gatherings and weddings, right? And this goes back to the ancient traditions and even up to today in the Arab world, where the weddings take place. In the Arab world, mostly the weddings are separate, completely, men and women completely separate. And so the men would even have a certain type of tribal dance, almost what we refer to like a form of toy-toying. And the fuqaha, when they mention and they speak about also the dancing that is permissible, and using this term just for want of translation, that it is movements in which the entire body is moving at one go. It is not that you're only moving the top of your body and the bottom half of your body is not moved. And the movements in which a person's waist is being moved separately from the top of their body, this they specifically mention this, and they say this is what is haram. Any movement which arouse people or which is regarded as immodest, and this is impermissible. And we would find also, with regards to these movements in Africa, even in certain cultures of the past, there would even be certain types of dhikr that they would do, right? In this form of movements where they would move their entire bodies in a swaying sort of motion. And a person should not be surprised if they travel to certain parts of the world and they see this happening. There is also the stories of the Sahaba who, when they received news of glad tidings from the Prophet about certain things, they would perform what is called a hajjal. And hajjal is a type of a dance in which a person hops on one leg, almost like hopping on one leg and going into a circle. And all these have sanction in the Sharia. And obviously a person has to be sensitive to the time, the place, the culture that they are in. And we understand all of these narrations in the sense and the practice in most of the Arab world where these things take place is where the gatherings are completely, absolutely segregated. There is absolutely no intermingling between men and women. Now, وكان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يكرم أهل الفضل في أخلاقهم ويتألف أهل الشرف في الإحسان إليهم وكان يكرم ذوي رحمه ويصلهم من غير أن يوثرهم على من هو أفضل منهم. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم would honor people of virtue for their good character, and he would win the people of nobility over through kind acts. He treated his kindred well without preferring them to the ones who were more virtuous than they were. And meaning the Prophet ﷺ gave everyone their right, and he understood and he knew people's rank with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he gave people respect and attention according to the rank that they first and foremost had with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then secondly the rank that they had in their societies and their communities. And the Prophet ﷺ would even say that every person should be given attention according to their stature. So for example, if someone is a leader in a community, he should be respected for that position which he holds. If someone is an imam, if someone is a teacher of the deen, right? Someone might be, for example, in some sort of position. He might be the head of a certain organization that is doing immense amount of khair and benefit. This person has to be respected. And this is not respecting people for the dunya. It's respecting them for the stature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them, right? Because even positions, leadership positions or positions, who gives those positions? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is the one that chooses the rulers, and He is the one who chooses the ruled. And so within a society, people are on different levels, and it is a form of da'wah, and it is a form of winning people's hearts over, that you treat them equally. If a dignitary comes in to visit a person, or comes, for example, to a class in which there is a lesson being taught, the dignitary is not expected to sit, right, as at the back. He should at least, for him in his own relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has to insist on sitting at the back. But those who are there must insist on bringing him forward. And we would see this in the practice also of some of the great scholars, where they would sometimes attend the gatherings of their fellow scholars, right? And they would sit at the back,
hiding, and the students and even the teacher who was teaching, which was one of his peers, or could have been someone that was younger than him, didn't even know. He would come and sit and hide behind a pillar, knowing that if people saw him, they would encourage him and tell him to come forward, and he wouldn't have any choice. So they would come late while the lesson is done, sit behind the pillar, and sometimes even leave before people could even see them. And this requires a great amount of humility and humbleness and putting oneself down, as opposed to if a person walks in and then they're expecting to be given preferential treatment. And so it has to work both ways. If one is in a position of stature or in a position of leadership, they have to put themselves down and not seek that. But the people around them also have to, according to the rules of the Sharia and the advice of the Prophet ﷺ, is to give people their due worth. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us tawfiq. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر فاتنا وإلى حضرة النبي سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم الفاتحة.